It's a pleasure to welcome you here today. My name is Laurie Thorlickson. I'm the director of the European Union Centre of Excellence, and we're delighted today to be able to welcome back to the U of A Dr. Remus Valsan. Remus is a lecturer in corporate law at the School of Law at the University of Edinburgh. Some of you here will know him from the time he spent here 10 years ago, where Remus completed his Master of Laws degree. He then went on to McGill to complete his Doctor of Civil Law at McGill, and his dissertation on fiduciary duties went on to win the Best Doctoral Dissertation Prize awarded by the Quebec Society for Comparative Law. Remus has returned as the European Union Centre of Excellence incoming research fellow for 2015, and he spent a couple of weeks here at the U of A where he's collaborating with Professor Yaya here in the Faculty of Law, and we're delighted to be able to offer this opportunity. The EU Centre of Excellence each year offers 1 or 2 incoming fellowships for this purpose, to allow scholars at the U of A to network with European colleagues. So without any further comments from me, I will pass the chair over to Remus to talk to us about gender diversity on boards of directors.
Thank you very much, Laurie, for this very kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to my presentation today. I would like to start by thanking the EU Centre of Excellence for inviting me and for their kind support while writing this paper. And I would also like to thank Professor Moinyaya and the Faculty of Law for the very warm welcome and for their hospitality during my stay here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be back here almost 10 years after coming here for the first time to start my LLM. So, as you can see from the title, my talk today is on gender diversity in boards of directors of large corporations. Diversity, in all its aspects, is a very current topic across all forms of organizations, across all industries, and across all continents. One recent, very interesting example comes from England. In January this year, the Right Reverend Libby Lane was the first female bishop to be appointed by the Church of England. And following her appointment, a growing number of male and female priests have argued for changing the official text of the Mass to include words like she or female, and to refer to God as a female rather than as a male. And the debates that have arisen around this issue have, one of the questions that has been asked was why is gender important in this particular aspect? Because God is supposed to be above, beyond any gender duality or any sort of categorization. And this is the sort of question that I'm going to ask myself and ask you today. Why is gender important in the boards of directors of companies? Because if we think from a strictly legal point of view, the rights, the obligations, the standards of conduct, the standards of liability, they are the same for whoever occupies an office of director. So in what sense is gender a corporate law or a corporate governance relevant aspect? Obviously, in a perfect world, we would not have to ask this question, why is diversity relevant? Because in a perfect world, diversity in the boards of directors would arise naturally from the equal distribution of talent between genders and among ethnicities. But unfortunately, we live in an imperfect world, which has a long history and long legacy of discrimination and prejudice. However, even in this imperfect world, diversity is rapidly becoming a value in itself. A reflection of the more fundamental values of equality and of justice. Nevertheless, in the corporate governance context, diversity and gender diversity, more specifically, is usually approached in an instrumental way. We talk about diversity in boards of directors mostly as a means to an end, to another end, and that end is employee satisfaction or increased employee welfare, or increased customer satisfaction, or increased firm profitability. And my paper, and the insight that I hope to share with you today, is best categorized, is best labeled as an instrumental approach to gender diversity. However, I do not mean to suggest that gender diversity in itself is not valuable, is not something that should be promoted. But I am interested in how gender actually plays a role in the boards of directors. So, in my paper, I will approach the issue of gender diversity from an outsider perspective. That is, I'm looking at the relation between the composition of the board and the relation of the company with various stakeholders, such as various long-term stakeholders, such as employees, creditors, or long-term suppliers. And I am contrasting that with the most dominant insider approach to gender diversity. So the insider discussions, they look at the effect that gender diversity has on the decision-making of the board. So they look inside the board, or they look inside the firm. They're trying to see whether diversity has effect on the profitability of the firm. And this insider approach has, at first glance, has quite a strong intuitive appeal to it. I mean, if we think of the board of directors as a working group, it makes perfect sense to say that having diverse members, or members with diverse backgrounds, would automatically would automatically result in more creative problem solving, and would avoid the polarization of ideas around one dominant view, which is the so-called groupthink problem. And obviously, if you think better discussions, more creative solutions, that equals better board decisions, that equals more profitable firms. However, there is a big problem with this sort of argument, in the sense that the vast amount of empirical research that has been carried trying to demonstrate a causal link between diversity and profitability or better board effectiveness has been inconclusive. And I will come back to the point later. So my argument, as I was saying, comes from an outsider perspective. And I will, the point that I will make, or at least that I'm trying to make in my paper, is that gender diversity is very important for the signal that it sends to certain long-term, risk-averse corporate stakeholders. And that signal is based on certain features that are more or less stereotypically associated with the female style of management. And the key feature that I'm interested in is risk aversion. As I will explain towards the end of my paper, of my presentation, women are perceived to be more risk averse, both in making investments on their own behalf and in investing on other people's behalf. And I believe that this risk aversion typically associated with female managers compared with risk-seeking of male managers creates sense to the long-term risk-averse stakeholders that the board has a balanced approach to risk. And this is extremely important in turbulent economic times, or especially as the company is approaching insolvency, where there is a tension, a clash between the risk preferences of shareholders and the risk preferences of other long-term investors. And I will come back to that as well. So my arguments will come from the signaling and relational role of the board of directors. Before coming to the theoretical part, let's have a look at some numbers and how gender diversity looks in the world and in the European Union. I hope you're able to see in the back, the contrast is not very great. This is the latest report that has been produced by Catalyst. Catalyst, perhaps some of you may know, is a US-based NGO that has been extremely active in promoting the cause of female employment equality, and is producing annual reports and ratings. So it's one of the sources the most used by the media and by the scholars when they're looking at numbers. Now, there are other organizations that are doing these sorts of number crunching to look at the percentages. So the numbers fluctuate slightly, especially with respect to Norway, and we're going to come back to that. But the general picture is the same. Norway is the country with the highest female members in the world, is above the other countries. So it is somewhere between 35 and 40% of seats in public corporations. At the other end, we have Japan, where presumably there are very few women in the board for cultural reasons. Canada ranks in the middle, the same as the United States, and slightly behind the United Kingdom. So Canada, US, and UK, they are more or less around the 20% seats of women in the board, which, as we're going to see, is exactly the average, the latest average in the European Union. Let's have a closer look at Norway and see why it has taken the lead in the world in women boards places. So Norway was the first country in the world to introduce mandatory quotas. The whole thing started in 2002 when the government encouraged public companies to strive for 40% of female seats by 2006. By 2005, the progress was really slow. They only went to about 24%. And therefore, in 2006, the Norwegian government adopted a legislation mandating all public companies to have to achieve the 40% target by 2008. So it's a very small window frame, only 2 years. And official statistics have shown that companies have there was full compliance with this requirement by 2009. That sounds excellent. So we see here between 2006 and 2009, there is a huge spike in female numbers justified by this legislation. This sounds all excellent, but there are some very interesting side effects of this law. The first one was that there was a very high shortage of qualified female directors to fill in the board seats. And these female directors became extremely sought after, and they got nicknamed the Golden Skirts. And a consequence of that was that female directors ended up holding significantly higher number of board positions compared to male directors. So in 2006, female directors held about 10 board positions, whereas the male counterparts had no more than 7 seats at one time. Now this number has these numbers have balanced in the recent years. So in 2013, the female had around 6 cumulative positions, whereas the men had 5. So the percentage has, the numbers have evened out almost. Another very interesting consequence was that the number of public companies, so the companies who were targeted by this measure, has decreased dramatically from 2006 to 2012. So in 2006, there were about 452 public companies, and in 2013, there were only 257. So lots of companies prefer to convert to a private company so they won't have to fall in the quota requirement. And another very interesting consequence is the fact that the law had almost zero impact outside the companies that it targeted. So if you look at the red line, these are the private companies who did not have this obligation. So there was almost no effect on the number of females in the boards of private companies. In terms of economic consequences, the opinions vary, but one study has shown that companies that were affected by the quota, or at least some of them, had a significant financial decline, so they lost significantly some of their value compared to their peers. But these authors were saying that this was due to the fact that the females that have been appointed were young and inexperienced. So it has nothing to do with the gender itself. It had to do with the set skills that these directors had. Another study, interestingly, showed that, again, companies that were affected by the quota compared to companies of a similar size, unaffected by quota because they're private companies or from other Scandinavian countries. So compared to these other companies affected by quota registered a change in their employment policy, in the sense that they had much fewer reduction in the workforce. So their employment costs were higher than that of their peers. So that affected the short-term profitability of the firm. So they were less willing to lay off people in times in hard economic times, and that resulted in higher employment costs. Staying within Europe, it's interesting to look at the UK, which is, in a sense, is a similar example to Norway, but in another sense is the opposite example. It's the opposite to Norway because UK has been very strong from the beginning against quotas. This is one of the reasons why the directive that I'm going to mention shortly is stuck in the European Council, because a number of countries led by the UK are very strongly opposed to quotas. So in 2010, when at the European Commission and EU level there were discussions about introducing quotas because the voluntary measures were not working, the UK government set up a commission chaired by Lord Davis to look at the obstacles that women face to reach in the board and to make proposals for what the government and the businesses can do to increase the percentage of the women. And the Davis Commission issued a report in 2011 suggesting a target for the FTSE 100 companies, that is the largest public companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, suggested for them to aim for a 25% target by 2015, so we are almost there, and 30% by 2020. And interestingly enough, these reports, which came out annually, always underline the threat of mandatory quotas that could come from the European Commission. So the message was, you either do it voluntarily or you have to do it in a way which may not suit you. And interestingly enough, between 2010 and 2015, the number of women in the board has doubled compared to the number that was between 2000 and 2010, where it rose between somewhere around 7% to 12%, so it was only about 5 percentage points. So I think the UK example shows that the market, if incentivized sufficiently, could actually do a great job in redressing this market failure, if you want, in a sense, or this inequality. Just to give you a clearer idea of what's happening in the UK, in addition to these reports, which are purely voluntary and tend to encourage or threaten companies to appoint female in the board, in addition to that, large companies have an obligation to disclose in their annual reports the policies that they have on a wide range of diversity issues, including gender diversity. So they need to have a policy and they need to disclose what that is, or if they don't, they need to explain why they don't have. So it's a comply or explain approach to disclosure. And that is very similar to what's happening in Canada, where I think last year, the provincial securities regulators introduced in a number of provinces a requirement for listed companies, again, to disclose their diversity policies or explain why they don't have one. And if I'm not wrong, the notable exceptions are the province of Alberta and British Columbia, where, to the extent of my knowledge, there are no such disclosure requirements. However, companies incorporated in Alberta or BC, which are listed at the Toronto Stock Exchange, they do fall under these disclosure requirements anyway. And at federal level, in Canada, again, we see something that looks very similar as the Davis report in the UK. Last year, the Advisory Council for Promoting Women on Boards, that's a Canadian body, issued a document called Good for Business, a plan to promote more women on Canadian boards, and they recommended Canadian listed companies to aim for 30% female in the board by 2019. But what's interesting, they ruled out any legislative interventions of anything that would look like a mandatory quota. And a similar comply or explain approach we see in the US, where the Securities and Exchange Commission has a disclosure requirement for listed companies, again, on their policies on diversity. So, looking at what's happening in the European Union, I'm sorry that the contrast is not very good. The average now is 20.2% of female in the board. The highest is France, which has recently introduced quota legislation. Those towards the bottom have 3 or 2%. But it's interesting to see that although there is progress being made on the non-executive positions in the board, when it comes to executives, female executives, the numbers is extremely low. That's 3.3%. Or female presidents of the board, that's 6.5%. So there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. So the debate nowadays at the European Union level refers to this legislative proposal adopted in November 2012. That is a proposal for a directive for a gender balance in the boards of directors. The history of the EU initiatives in this field, however, is very long. It started in the 1980s and 1990s, when the European Council issued recommendations and encouragements to the member states and to the companies to do something to redress the inequality of women in employment. Then it started with a series of documents that again were on a voluntary basis, were addressed to the companies and aimed to encourage them to increase their percentage of female in the board, but the progress was extremely slow. So since October 2010, when the discussions about a possible introduction of quota have started, we see that they actually started to go up, the numbers. This is the trend. The orange line is the trend that the prediction of how the numbers would look if the trend from 2003 to 2010 would have continued. So absent all these urges, nowadays female would be somewhere on below the 14%. So that's a bit cropped here. So that shows in itself that the market would have been much slower than it is right now. However, so the directive proposal that has been adopted in November sets a threshold of 40% for the underrepresented sex, obviously the women, by 2020, and the flexi quota, that is, each company decides what they want, how many executives they want by 2020. In terms of sanctions, the European Commission proposed fines, naming and shaming. That is, the local authority would publish a decision to impose administrative fines, would say that the breach that the company was found guilty of, and the amount of the fine imposed. So negative publicity, that's probably something that no company wants. And finally, the annulment of the appointments of the non-executive directors that are in breach of the provisions of the local, of the member state. Because as you know, a directive does not have direct application, has to be implemented by each member state through its own legislation. This directive, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been adopted in 2012 by the Commission, has been approved in 2013 by the European Parliament in the first reading, and now it's stuck in the European Council probably for a long time. As you know, the European Council is the second legislative chamber, so a directive has to be approved by the Council and the Parliament based on the co-determination principle. So in the Council now, there is a strong opposition from 9 member states, and they are led by the UK. And they are saying, first of all, it's not very clear that the European Commission and the European Union has authority to legislate on this particular aspect based on the subsidiarity principle, which says that it's first and foremost up for the member states to adopt their policies, and only if there is a failure at member state level and the EU can do a better job, then the question should arise on legislation at the EU level. And another critique of the quotas was that, I mean, this is very common sense. One size does not fit all. Each member state should be allowed to adopt the the system that works for its realities and the thresholds that they want. Very quickly, I think it's interesting to note that while this directive was stuck in council and was being blocked and there were so many debates, there were two other directives that actually went through, and they have gender diversity provisions. One of them refers to the prudential supervision of credit institutions and investment firms and says that these firms need to have a gender balance policy and to disclose it. And the second directive, which entered into force last year, concerns disclosure of diversity across a range of areas. Applies to large companies. So these companies have to disclose their policy with regard to age, gender, education, and professional backgrounds. And not only do they have to disclose the policy that they have to say how they're implementing the policy, what results they're achieving, or if they don't have a policy, they have to explain why they believe this is not the case. So it's not necessary, it's a comply or explain. Okay, I'm sorry if I rushed a bit over that because I really am aware of time and I want to make sure I have enough time to get to the more theoretical part. So let's now look at the research of what scholars are saying about gender diversity in the board of directors. But before that, I have to flag up a number of difficulties that any researcher has to face, has to think about when they're addressing specifically gender diversity. And the first one is the fact that there are multiple aspects of diversity which are equally important. So we could talk about observable aspects of diversity, which include age, ethnicity, race, religion, professional qualification, whether a director is independent, executive, or representative of the employees, where the employees have the right to appoint members in the board. So why should we only focus on gender from a corporate governance point of view when there are so many other aspects of visible diversity? And even within the gender and sexuality studies have now moved way beyond, or perhaps have moved beyond the duality of female-male. There are other forms of gender identification which, from a social justice perspective, are equally as valid. I mean, if we're talking about equal opportunity and fairness and diversity as a value in itself, then we have to talk about asexuality or agender people or transgender. So there is a bigger spectrum. And more importantly, though, there are the non-observable aspects of diversity, which refer to the values, social, political culture, the knowledge, expertise, or risk appetite that the directors bring to the board. So if we're talking about making the board diverse because it's good for corporate governance, we have to think, are we using the observable elements as a proxy to the non-observable ones, which are perhaps the ones that really make a difference? Another added difficulty is the fact that a number of scholars are saying that the board composition is not really that important when it comes to the effectiveness of the board decision making. What matters are the board processes. And these processes, some examples are effort norms, cognitive conflict, use of knowledge and skills. So effort norms refers to the amount of effort that the board member is supposed to put in before coming to a board meeting. What are the expectations? What are the norms? How prepared do you have to come to the board? Cognitive conflict. Is it acceptable to engage in exchanges of ideas? Is that encouraged? Are there debates taking place? Use of knowledge. How effective is the chairman of the board, for example, to allow a specialist to present their knowledge. Sometimes people who have knowledge, they're not given a chance to use it. And finally, it's difficult to talk about gender diversity in abstracto without looking at how actually gender looks across industry fields. And we are going to see that there are differences in various industry fields. So across the world, a recent survey by Governance Metric International showed that women are more represented in retail, media, utilities, personal household goods, healthcare, so industries that are more end consumer faced. And there are very little represented in chemicals, basic resources, and automobile parts. And if we look at the United States, again, Catalyst has drawn up this table with the largest listed companies. And we see that the company with the largest number of females is Avon, has 7 women out of 11, so that's 63%, which is exceptionally high. Estée Lauder, Macy's, Procter & Gamble, Michael Kors. So these are the industries where we see female directors. And from a relational theory point of view, this makes complete sense because it's all about networks with your customers and with your suppliers. But I'll come back to that later. And women were companies that have 0 women in very large boards. So here we're looking at 11 seats are from oil and gas, automotive, energy, mining. And we have to wonder, I mean, should we be a bit more specific when we're talking about quotas? Perhaps, do we need to think of fields? Because the market is showing that not all industry fields, for some reason, value presence of women, or is this actually a problem that has to be redressed? Okay. So what are people saying about the reasons to have women on board? The first reason is the social justice argument. So this is in the context of corporate governance. And the social justice argument is saying that gender balance is the right thing to do. It's a matter of fundamental fairness, and it's a way of redressing a long history of discrimination. So we should look no further. That's a good explanation in itself. However, in an Anglo-American system, which is focused on shareholder value, these sorts of fairness arguments, they are not very convincing. It's very hard to tell the shareholders why the company should, if it's costly to have extra women, why this cost should be incurred if there is no tangible return to the shareholders. So the fairness in itself may not always work. Now, the business case argument is the argument that is the most popular with the media and with the activists and with the NGOs. And this is partly because there are lots of reports that are showing positive correlations between corporate performance and gender diversity. However, in almost all these research studies that are respectable, there is a tiny line saying that correlation does not demonstrate causation. So we see that companies with higher percentage of women in the boards are more profitable, but we don't know which way, whether there's a causal link and which way it goes. So here is an example. Again, by a research by Catalyst last year shows that women that have had 3 or more companies that have had 3 or more females in the board over the past over the past 4 or 5 years, the period of the study, they outperformed significantly comparable companies with 0 women in the board. So return on sales, plus 84%. Return on invested capital, plus 60%. Return on equity, plus 46%. These are the sorts of numbers that get picked by the media immediately. However, this doesn't get picked. These studies have examined historical data and revealed statistically significant correlations. The studies do not, however, establish or imply a causal connection. And that could mean that, A, indeed, gender is the cause for these companies to be more profitable. It could also mean, B, companies that are more profitable have the resources to hire, to expand the seat in the board and to hire more females. C, companies that are more profitable are targeted by the media. They face a bigger pressure by the media, so they have to appoint these women in the board because they are in the spotlight. Or D, I think, highly qualified female directors are a scarce commodity, and they prefer to go to the companies who pay the most, so who are the most profitable. So there are lots of explanations why this could happen. So this is why the business case, unfortunately, is not convincing. Another aspect, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is part of the insider approach to justifying business case, refers to what's happening in the board of directors. So there are many scholars who are saying that women bring to the table more diverse views. They ask tricky questions. They actually generate cognitive conflict. Interestingly enough, a series of qualitative studies that have been carried by 2 professors from North Carolina University and from Duke University between 2008 and 2013, they published a series of papers. They conducted interviews with members of the board, with proxy advisors, with executives, and with other actors who were involved in the board decision. And they asked them to give examples or anecdotes of how a female director was able to enrich the discussion simply because of her gender. And these studies have found that although everybody agrees, there is a unanimous agreement that gender diversity is good in the boards of directors, directors had actually a very hard time giving an example of this sort of contribution that was related to gender and not to the skill sets or personality or any other features of the director. And related to this, if you pick up a study or an article about female in the board, you are bound to find the groupthink problem. The argument, and even the European Commission has used this a lot, and the Davis Commission has used it a lot. It's basically saying that having groups that are very cohesive lead to errors in the decision-making process and therefore to faulty decisions. And the groupthink was introduced by the psychologist Irving Janis in a context of political studies. So the argument is, because the boards are all male, all white most of the time, we have this groupthink problem whereby the opinions are polarized around one view due to the loyalty to the group. So group is cohesive, there is a high degree of loyalty, and dissent is suppressed. Nobody wants to contradict what all the others are very enthusiastic about. But the groupthink theory, if you read more about it, is saying that cohesiveness is only one precondition for the groupthink to arise. In addition to cohesiveness, we need other preconditions, such as lack of impartial chair chairing of the board. So there's a chairman who is very partial, who is not objective. Lack of methodology. The board does not have a methodology to go about adopting decisions. Situations of crisis and other elements. Because otherwise, cohesion could actually be a great thing. A group that is very cohesive, but that has a great methodology and a chairman that is objective could actually increase the value. So saying that we need female in the board to address the groupthink problem is a very simplistic way of making the case. Now, the theory that I agree with, and this is where my paper aims to contribute, refers to the relations with the corporate constituencies. And this is based on the signaling theory. The signaling theory is a theory that applies in economics across a variety of aspects. But in this particular context, it is saying that companies employ women in the board because they want to send signals to relevant actors in the market to communicate information that is otherwise very difficult to perceive by these actors. So the kinds of signals that could be send signals to current or prospective employees. So companies want to show to their employees that they value equally males and females. Signals to customers. They want to signal to them that they know the demographics and they know their needs. Or simply signal to the wider public to say that the company is progressive and is socially responsible. So could be any one of these signals or all of them. So what I aim to do in my paper is, first of all, to provide a theoretical framework of why companies need to send signals to their stakeholders, because based on what is now the dominant understanding of large corporations in the Anglo-American model, this dominant understanding comes from a neoclassical law and economics perspective, which is focused on the so-called agency theory and the principal-agent conflict. So the dominant theory of large corporations are saying that the boards are appointed primarily to monitor the executives on behalf of shareholders. So they're saying that this is the most important role of the board. They have to monitor. Anything else is almost not discussed, out of discussion. And of course, the law adds a few other duties, duty of oversight to set the strategic policy of the company. However, there is a whole bunch of literature coming from organizational behavior and management who are saying that an equally important role of the board is the relational board. The board is appointed by shareholders to create networks with various resources that the company needs to survive and to decrease uncertainty in hard economic times. So the relational role of the board is actually essential for the survival of the firm. And this is why in this theoretical framework it makes sense for the board to actually want to send signals to the long-term stakeholders. And finally, I want to add here letter D by saying that another signal that the board sends by appointing females is that it has a balanced risk policy. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a body of literature that purports to show that females are more risk averse, both in their own decisions and on deciding for the others. The discussions about risk attitude are far more complicated, but for my paper, I think it's sufficient if there is a perception that the female management style is more risk averse, and therefore the corporate stakeholders who are more risk averse, they have a sort of assurance that in hard economic times, or as the company is approaching insolvency, their investment in the company is not going to be gambled away as the shareholders would have wanted. Well, this was my paper. So I'm very happy to take any questions or comments that you may have.
We have just a few minutes to take a few quick questions and start.
Yes.
This is a prejudiced comment. I've never been on a board or anything, but it's always been my impression that these board members are simply appointed by the directors, the CEO, and so on of the company, and
Yeah.
ratified in the annual board meeting.
Yeah.
That it's more a public relations thing. The only
Yeah.
time you hear about changes in the board are when there's a really big uprising among the stockholders about some particular event, and then that reaches the news. But otherwise, these guys seem to be just rubber stamps.
Absolutely.
Guys and girls in this case.
Yeah, it has been flagged up as a problem of the procedures the companies have in place to nominate candidates for the board, and indeed the CEO suggests something to the nomination committee, and then the nomination committee formally proposes. But the headhunters are actually playing an important part in that, because the headhunters are the ones who are looking in the market, and some of them are suggesting to the CEO, to the nomination committee, candidates that look very much like the directors that the company already has, because they believe that this is what the company wants. So in the UK, there is a big debate and a big awareness that's been created for the recruitment and the pipeline process for these headhunters to actually look at. There are databases of qualified female directors, so they should actually look at that database. But I agree with you. There's a huge problem in how directors are actually appointed and what are the networks.
You said that 9 members of EU are approved the proposal
Yeah.
for the EU. Is there any obligation on behalf of the EU to increase the votes or something in the next year? Or
Sorry, an obligation to increase?
to increase the female in the board or something, accepting the proposal? I mean.
Well, as the situation is right now, the directive has not been adopted. So the only obligation that now member states have is to implement legislation to ask companies to disclose their policies. So companies need to do this on a voluntary basis. This is what we want to do. This is our targets. But there is no mandatory obligation so far. But the votes of these member states are needed for the proposal to be adopted.
And one last question.
What data or how did you analyze the risk aversion component as perceived as a female trait? It
Yeah.
seems like that's the one that would be most interesting, especially here in Alberta with the Alberta Securities Commission, is if you have made that correlation, what kind of data did you use?
Yeah.
How did you make that case? Because it's everything that you did so far was great, and it gave. But I just wanted to know at the end. I wanted to hear more about D.
That's an extremely important point, and you've probably poked a hole actually in my argument, because I am using meta studies, so the studies that summarize the studies that have done by other researchers in this field, and these meta studies are saying that there is strong evidence that females tend to be cognitively more risk averse, and there are other studies that show that they, for example, when female manage a portfolio of assets, they tend to invest in less riskier assets, so their whole portfolio is less risky. So I am using the empirical research that has been carried by someone else, but I'm going to flag up some of the problems with that empirical research. But I think for my argument, the most important is the perception. And I think there is a perception, whether that's actually true or not. And the perception is actually important because that's the signal that is sent to the long-term stakeholders.
We're at 1 o'clock now, so I'll step in to thank all of you for turning out today to this talk, to thank Remus for a very interesting lecture, and to Professor Yaya and the Faculty of Law for their generous hosting of this event.
Thank you to all of you, and my email was at the beginning, so if you have any questions or if you'd like to have a conversation, I'm more than happy to talk to you at any time, so please feel free to approach me.